In 2022, we talked a lot about abandoned cameras, and don't worry, we have plenty more episodes coming this year. But in this video, we are taking a peek into the potential future, using all of our research, insights, and trends we discovered while making the first 15 episodes. We have seen some indicators of a specific camera that is on the verge of being abandoned in 2023, which is pretty surprising considering the amount of fanfare it got at release. So stick around as we peer into the crystal ball on this special episode of our Abandoned Camera series. When taking a look at our past episodes and the deep dives we did on each camera, there are several key factors that contributed to the demise of many cameras in the past. Taking all of that information and data into account, we looked at the current market and specific trends of camera companies and new cameras that fit this mold and identified a popular camera we think likely could be abandoned in the near future. But of course, we had some cameras worth mentioning that fit this mold as well, including the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, the Canon C100, and the Sigma FP. But because a lot of these fit end-of-life status, we decided to just mention them and not include them in the full video. As we know, you are all sticklers for that abandoned terminology you like to get me on sometimes. This brings us to the camera that we are projecting as the most likely to really be abandoned, and we mean like really abandoned. And this is none other than the highly touted DJI Ronin 4D camera.
We introduce DJI Ronin 4D, a comprehensive cinematography solution designed to reimagine what the next generation of filmmaking will be.
And while I sort of thought many would be shocked by this prediction, in our research and polling, it seemed like many within our community groups are not surprised by it. But why is this? Well, let's dig into this fascinating camera and why it shares several troubling markers of abandoned cameras of the past. DJI, a well-known drone manufacturer, released a brand new camera in late 2021 that many lauded as the future of cinematography. DJI seemingly gave any YouTuber of note one of these cameras to make a video on for the release day. And because of the overwhelmingly positive response, many accused DJI of paying off YouTubers to give good reviews on this camera, which, in all fairness, with how everything came out at the same time, it did feel a bit like one big collaborative marketing campaign. But saying the YouTubers that covered it were bought out is a very complicated accusation to make. Nonetheless, while the massive influx of reviews seemed a bit much, everyone seemed generally positive toward this new camera and the potential it brought to the industry. Since then, however, it's been pretty quiet on this camera. This could be, of course, attributed to a normal shifting of interest, but I see at the very least 4 strong indicators that this camera could be in trouble. So let's talk about those. The first indicator that matches the profile of other abandoned cameras is that while DJI is known for making cameras for their drones, they've never actually really made a true digital cinema camera before. And this falls in line with companies like Dalsa, AJA, Lytro, Iconoscope, and yes, even the good old Fran 8K. These companies wanted to get into the game, but ultimately failed where other competitors who have been making cameras for generations like Arri would survive. And really the only camera whose downfall we could attribute to the switch from film to digital is the Dalsa. But the story with that camera still fits this scenario. As Dalsa employee Alan Lasky once said, if you want to make $1 million in Hollywood, you have to spend $100 million. And while I don't think DJI has plans to take over Hollywood with their camera or even necessarily target that market at all, the sentiment still remains. DJI will have to spend significant amounts of money to develop this camera out further. But what makes me think those sales might not be that good? Well, that's our next indicator. The fact that it projects heavily as a niche camera is our second indicator. While the technological advancements for this camera are extraordinary and has a chance to change how we view cameras, it also limits itself because of that. You're locked into the configuration this camera is for the most part. And while you'd save money buying this camera over rigging a traditional camera the same way, you could only really use this camera for a specific style. Sure, DJI has some built-in features to help you get the most out of this camera, but it's harder to see this camera being sold at a broader level. Many see this as an event camera for weddings and concerts, as well as being a good indie filmmaker camera. But I have a harder time believing that it's the first camera indie filmmakers would look to. And that's mostly because it's incredibly expensive when you include all of the accessories and the limited native lens selection for it that's also expensive. Sure, you can use some third-party lenses, but there are limitations on those as well, and what you can even do with the LiDAR focusing system. And even with the interchangeable lens mounts, it just makes it difficult to use in certain scenarios and gives you a lot less flexibility, which gets us into our third indicator. In their first iteration, they have too many new gimmicks. Just like Owens' first digital camera, the Penelope Delta, the camera that bankrupted them, essentially, the DJI Ronin 4D falls into the same trap of trying to add too many gimmicks to their first major digital camera. Sure, they have a ton of experience with gimbal systems and some of the parts that went into building this camera, but it still makes it incredibly complex and complicated for a first-time camera from a company that's never made one. This meant higher upfront costs in R&D and higher costs after release from all of the various issues you will have with a first camera iteration like this. Add to that the issue of trying to secure raw formats for the camera, but ultimately dropping it because of the red patent, the fact that DJI has never tried to make a main camera before with a type of sensor that can handle it, and of course the very limiting lens selection hurts them a lot in my opinion. It would have been better to build a more traditional vanilla camera to start off with that could be outfitted or paired with the Ronin 4D at a later point. Get your basics down first and work out the bugs with the sensor and image issues, menu navigation and software issues before you introduce a product that is trying to revolutionize cameras. Historically, that just does not work very often. It's a big, expensive gamble for DJI to continue to make a camera like this if they are not seeing the profits they want to see. But why do I keep saying that it might be too expensive for a company that made a reported $3.8 billion in 2021? Well, that's due to our last indicator. And this is one affected by a factor no other abandoned camera company has had to deal with to this extent, and that's global politics. In October of 2022, DJI was officially blacklisted by the US Department of Defense due to claimed ties to the Chinese military. What does this mean exactly? Well, it clears the way for the US president to impose heavy sanctions against DJI because of the national security threat it may or may not impose on the US. To make matters worse for DJI, they've been added to a US Treasury listing in 2021 that effectively barred US investment into the firm. DJI is of course fighting back against this, claiming that we are not a military company in response to the US. But with geopolitical tensions running high currently in the region due to the war in Ukraine and the US and the Chinese tension over Taiwan, it doesn't seem likely that DJI will get removed from these lists anytime in the near future. And on top of all this, many have reported, whether true or not, that China is losing manufacturing work to other Asian countries in the area. They do indicate potential financial consequences for DJI in the future that are out of their control. Pair that with a likely expensive development of the Ronin 4D and the likelihood that, while being popular, it's not being widely sold, based on speculation of course, it feels like trouble for DJI even beyond the camera itself. With all that said, it makes this camera the most likely to be abandoned in 2023 based on data and historical precedents. It's not easy to build a camera, as we've seen countless times. While I'm not sure 100% that 2023 will end this camera, it seems likely that this camera project may not be worth it for DJI in the long run, which is kind of a bummer for such a cool camera. But if you're interested in an actual abandoned camera that's actually been abandoned and not just speculation, you should check out our most watched abandoned camera episode of 2022 right now. Just click right there.